Henry Ford had only a modest education. He didn't invent the gasoline engine. He didn't invent the automobile. In fact, he never really invented anything. And yet, by the time he died in 1947, Ford and the company he founded had a profound effect on the world he taught to drive. Given all that he accomplished, it's hard to believe that Henry Ford was almost 40 when he established the Ford Motor Company. At the time, America was more agricultural than industrial, and horseless carriages were toys for a wealthy few. But in just 4 decades, Henry Ford had, in his own words, invented the modern age. Join me now as Biography presents Henry Ford.
He gave the car to America.
I think Henry Ford may have been the most influential man of the 20th century.
He made bitter enemies.
He was a nasty individual.
He believed in hard work.
Yes, indeed. If a young man makes up his mind to work, there's no limit to what he can do.
And he demanded hard work.
To work at Ford's at that time, you had to give up your dignity, your manhood.
He was praised by everyone from President Herbert Hoover to public enemy number 1, John Dillinger.
And he's a man who changed the way we all live.
He was an American legend who gave us mass production, the Model T, the V8, and the traffic jam.
It's all because of my great-grandfather.
Henry Ford, this man who gave America the automobile and mass production, was born while the Civil War was still raging. July 30th, 1863, William and Mary Ford, owner of one of the more substantial homesteads in Dearborn, Michigan, had their first surviving child, a son, Henry. Henry Ford didn't like the hard life of farming that he'd been born into, but at least the local one-room schoolhouse offered some escape from the long hours and endless chores. And he was naturally curious.
Henry Ford was a natural-born mechanic. He had innate ability. One of the first places that he was able to begin to hone that ability was when he received a watch for his 13th birthday. Like a lot of little boys who wanted to know about machines, he took that watch apart. Unlike most little boys, he was able to put the watch back together again.
But in 1876, Henry Ford's orderly world fell apart. His beloved mother, Mary, died during childbirth. Henry was 12. The loss left him reeling.
Henry had a story about the first time he ever saw a working machine. It happened just after his mother had died, and psychologists wonder whether this had some sort of effect, the two events being linked. He was going along with his father, and he saw one of the farm machines that were used in those days coming towards him down the track, but with one addition: it was moving itself because the engineer had fixed a chain from the axle of the machine to the wheels. So it was a sort of crude, self-propelling motor car. And for Henry Ford, this was like the road to Damascus. He'd never seen anything like this.
Ford knew then that he wanted to work with machines. So at the age of 16, he left the farm and walked the 9 miles into Detroit. There, he eventually found work at the Dry Dock Company, makers of iron boats. It gave him a chance to work on motors. Ford's practical education had begun. After apprenticing for 3 years, Henry Ford determined that he'd learned all he was going to at the dry dock and returned to the family farm. But he didn't leave his love of machines behind in the big city. He hired on with the Westinghouse Company to demonstrate and repair machines throughout southern Michigan. During this period, Henry met a young friend of his sister Mary. Her name was Clara Bryant, and he knew she was right. Clara resisted at first, but finally relented. On a spring day in 1888, wearing a wedding dress she had made herself, Clara Jane Bryant married Henry Ford. Ford built this home for his young bride and tried to settle down to life on the farm. But the farmer's life didn't satisfy Henry Ford's ambition. The industrial age was taking root in the cities, and Ford wanted to be a part of the excitement. On a trip to Detroit, Ford had become interested in the gasoline-powered automobile, like this one built by the Duryea brothers of Springfield, Massachusetts. There was a revolution going on, and Ford wanted in. In 1891, Henry Ford moved his young wife to Detroit and took a job at the Edison Illuminating Company. Here, he moved swiftly through the ranks, more than doubling his starting salary when he was promoted to chief engineer. And the extra income helped. On November 6, 1893, Clara Ford gave birth to a hardy baby boy, Edsel Bryant Ford. Newly inspired, Ford set out to build that gasoline-powered vehicle that had been taking shape in his mind.
Henry Ford had an enormous capacity for concentration. He became something of a mad professor when he was actually working on a project. And so when he was building his first internal combustion engine, his own version of it, he got so wrapped up that he brought it home on Christmas Eve when his poor wife was cooking the turkey and getting the meal ready and everything. And right in the middle of all this, he stuck the machine on the kitchen sink, screwed it to the sink, got his wife, whose hands were all covered with gravy and stuff, to actually drip gasoline into the top of it. He connected the wires and started the machine and was quite oblivious to the fact that he was filling the kitchen with clouds of exhaust smoke.
In a shed behind his home, Ford's automobile slowly took shape. With the help of friends from the Edison Company, he began building the vehicle he called the quadricycle. It was called this for good reason. His plan called for two bicycles to be placed side by side and powered by a crude gasoline engine. On the night of June 4th, 1896, he was ready for a test run. Aside from one breakdown, the trip was a success. Henry Ford had made his first car. It was only 3 years later that Ford took a local backer for a ride around Detroit. By the time that ride was over, they were in business. The Detroit Automobile Company opened with Ford as the mechanical superintendent. But the venture only lasted a year. Ford could make a car run, but he wasn't capable yet of manufacturing enough of those cars to make a company run. Ford wasn't discouraged, though. He hatched a new plan: to build a racer.
Ford saw racing as a way to spread the word about his cars and spread the name of his cars. And that was one of the reasons that he and his backers in his second company finally parted the ways, because they got tired of him racing. They wanted him to devote his energies to the production car.
But Ford continued racing, and with the notoriety, got the backers he needed to form the Ford Motor Company. He designed his company's first car and set out to conquer production problems that had plagued him in the past. He set up shop, hired men, put out a car, and waited. In July 1903, Ford sold his first car, a Model A, to a Chicago dentist. Two-time failure Henry Ford, at the age of 40, was about to experience success beyond anything he dreamed possible. By 1904, over 500 Model A's had been sold. Henry Ford, here pictured with his son Edsel, celebrated this success by buying his first dress suit. At the same time, Ford Motor Company was upgrading the line with the Model B. It was bigger, more powerful, and considerably more expensive than the Model A. But Henry Ford just couldn't get comfortable with the notion of a luxury car.
From the beginning, there seemed to have been two strands in American car making. There were the people who were making horseless carriages for the rich, loading them down, making them heavy and luxurious. And then there was Henry Ford, who had this idea that a car should be able to go along the rutted tracks. It should be able to drive across a plowed field. A farmer should be able to use it and take a wheel off it and fix a chain to it and cut some trees down or husk some corn. That was all he was interested in from the start.
Henry Ford brought this vision into the shop and tinkered until he came up with his ideal automobile, the Model T.
The Model T was simple, reliable for its day. It was very, very rugged. It was fairly high off the ground, had good ground clearance, which sounds like an odd thing to use in its advantage, but in the days when roads were often wagon ruts, ground clearance was very important. And it was also cheap.
The Model T was an astounding success. It went on sale in October 1908, and within a few months, Ford was forced to announce that the company couldn't accept new orders. The factory was already swamped, months behind. Henry Ford had succeeded in making an automobile for the masses, but it left him with a problem: how to build up production to satisfy demand. At the time, craftsmen building cars at stationary workbenches could produce 25 Model Ts a day, but 25 weren't enough. So Henry Ford and his engineers came up with a revolutionary new idea: the moving assembly line. August 1913, a chassis was put in motion at Ford's Highland Park plant. It moved past a line of carefully positioned men and components. At peak efficiency, the old system had spit out a finished T in 12.5 man-hours. With the chassis in motion, that time dropped to less than half that. Within a year, it took just 93 minutes to make a car. With production getting more and more efficient, Ford was able to cut hundreds of dollars off the price of his car. Cutting prices enabled Ford to achieve what he claimed were his two aims in life: to bring the pleasures of the automobile to as many people as possible, and to provide a large number of high-paying jobs for his workers. But there was a factor in the equation that he hadn't yet considered. Mass production was burning up labor. The worker had only to do a single task as the job passed his station. Time after time, hour after hour, day after day. The endless repetition took its toll.
To work at Ford's at that time, you had to give up your dignity, your manhood, and your self-sense. You had no control over those things at all. You were just at the mercy of the Ford Motor Company.
If you worked on that line, you sweated. You really worked hard. You're kind of a slave to that line. And you went to bed at night and you dreamed about working. You worked all night long in your dreams.
The turnover rate became such a problem that the company had to hire close to 1,000 men for every 100 jobs it hoped to fill. And hiring and training men cost money. Something had to be done. Again, Ford came up with an answer: the $5 day. Henry Ford would pay his workers more than twice the going rate. It was front-page news across the country. Workers flocked to the gates of Ford Motor Company. The $5 day made good business sense, but Ford was also genuinely trying to improve the lives of his workers. Henry Ford had experienced a healthy dose of success with the Model T and again with the $5 day. On the strength of this public approval, Ford began to feel that he should speak out on other issues. And with Europe exploding into war, he tried international politics. A young reporter sent out to interview Ford came back with a story quoting the carmaker as saying that he would give everything he possessed to stop the war. As the story spread, a noted peace activist approached Henry Ford. She found him a willing listener. Ford agreed to attend a meeting that very weekend in New York. There, his name was added to a delegation that would petition the warring governments.
They weren't the sort of people that he would normally have got involved in, but they did flatter him. It was a simple sort of solution. Charter a ship, go to Europe, stop the war. Henry Ford can produce a Model T. Why can't he stop a world war? It was an illustration both of his idealism and now of his arrogance.
The peace delegation was far from united around the cause. As members fell to arguing and backbiting, the shipboard press delighted in sending scathing stories home. By the time the ship docked in Norway, Ford was deeply discouraged. He left for the States just a few days after landing. Back home, though, Ford found himself again a hero to the common man, a modern-day Don Quixote. Maybe it had been foolish to think that he could end the war, but even his critics admitted that at least he had tried. When America did enter the war, Henry Ford stood by his country. With American boys leaving home, Ford opened his company's facilities to the government. The government, and the country for that matter, considered Henry Ford capable of producing miracles. Model Ts served as ambulances and staff cars. And with Allied shipping in the North Atlantic plagued by German submarines, the Navy turned to Ford to build the Eagle boat, a sub-chaser. But by Armistice Day, only a handful had been delivered. With the war over, Ford could turn his attention to other matters. And there was one matter he found especially irritating. It was the issue of who really controlled Ford Motor Company.
I think things really began to change for Henry Ford in 1919 when he bought out all his stockholders. And he increasingly felt that they were interfering with the way he wanted to run the company. And with his wife and with Edsel became the sole owners of Ford Motor Company. From that point on, he personally had the majority stock. From that point on, he was in effect dictator of Ford Motor Company. He didn't have to answer to anybody else. Personally now, I think this is a classic case of absolute power corrupting.
And what Henry Ford planned to do with that power was far grander than anything he had done before. The tough, shrewd businessman that ran Ford Motor Company was a much different man at home with the family.
As I remember my great-grandfather, he was very sort of tall and thin, and he had the most incredibly hard handshake. And I remember that because each time I went there, he always shook my hand first and then gave me a kiss hello. And I always used to think, oh my God, he's broken my bones. He was very soft as far as being around children was concerned. I mean, he wasn't, don't do this, don't do that, that kind of thing. I think he enjoyed it when we did come around to play.
Henry Ford was a dreamer. Once the old stockholders had been bought out, he was free to lead Ford Motor Company anywhere his imagination took him. And that was often a long way from automaking. He also produced the Fordson tractor. He tried to bring aviation to everyone's driveway with a single-passenger flivver plane. Henry Ford operated an early airmail route and the first regularly scheduled passenger flights, here promoted by the Our Gang Kids. He set up and funded several experimental schools. And at the Edison Institute at Greenfield Village, Ford's museum and restored American town, he created a tribute to the spirit of innovation, honoring such greats as his friend, Thomas Edison. But the grandest of Henry Ford's dreams was the Rouge, a plant that was itself a giant machine. He built that plant along the banks of the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan. And in its time, it was the greatest industrial complex on Earth. It is still today an industrial wonder, a lasting tribute to the power of Henry Ford's dreams and his incredible determination. About the time that the first blast furnaces at the Rouge were being fired, Henry Ford again offered the world his thinking. But this time his thinking was tainted by anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism was very common in the farm communities of the Midwest at the end of the last century. It went with mistrust of the East, of the banking system, all sorts of things like this. And Henry Ford's prejudices were those of an ordinary Midwest farmer. The tragedy of it was that he had the money and the conceit to put his ideas on paper and actually publish his own magazine, which spread it all around America and, of course, made him a laughingstock.
Through the Dearborn Independent, Ford blamed the Jewish people for everything from World War to short skirts, cheap movies, and jazz music. It wasn't until he faced a libel suit, public disapproval, and the continued pleas of friends that Henry Ford tendered an apology. But there were those who doubted the sincerity of that apology. In July 1938, Ford accepted Germany's Grand Cross, the highest honor the Third Reich could bestow on a foreigner. As the 20s wore on, Rouge workers continued to pump out hundreds of thousands of Model Ts. But Henry Ford began to find himself falling behind the times. He liked an older America. He was never comfortable in the modern world that he had helped to shape. His son Edsel, by this time second in command at Ford, was from another generation entirely. He liked jazz, contemporary art, and an occasional cocktail. Henry Ford was a teetotaler. He preferred bird watching and old-time country dancing. In this rare footage, Ford demonstrates just how far he'd go to popularize those old steps, even choosing an occasional Ford executive as a partner. While Henry Ford was dancing, the marketplace was changing in ways that he could never understand. For the first time in almost 2 decades, Ford's Tin Lizzy had a serious competitor.
The car that really did in the Model T was the Chevrolet. General Motors recognized fairly early what Edsel Ford had recognized, that once the market was, the actual need for automobiles was satisfied, you needed a way to continue to convince people to buy new cars, even if they didn't really need one, even if their old one wasn't worn out. One of the ways you do that is you change the way cars look every year, and you make the car look more pleasing.
In May 1927, the Model T era came to a close. The success of the Chevrolet demonstrated that the public wanted style and not just utility. The Tin Lizzy was hopelessly outdated, relegated to a recycling campaign. For years, Ford Motor Company had been dedicated to a single purpose, producing Model Ts. But the market demanded change.
Edsel was the one that really convinced his father, Henry Ford, that, we ought to bring out the Model A, Dad, because the T's a perfectly good car, but we've built it for 20 years and we haven't made any changes.
And change was just what Ford needed, but it came at a cost. Thousands of Ford workers were laid off. They sat home 6 months while Henry Ford tried to figure out some way to get back into the marketplace. At the age of 64, he was starting over. But the old man was up to the challenge. With the release of a brand new Model A, Ford Motor Company came roaring back to life.
Model A was an excellent automobile. It wasn't revolutionary like the Model T. It wasn't a car that pushed the boundaries of automobile design, but it was a thoroughly up-to-date, thoroughly modern car.
The Model A was a rare triumph for the partnership of Henry and Edsel Ford. Over the years, their relationship had fallen apart. Henry wanted his son to be tougher, more assertive. He thought that by publicly reversing his son's decisions and disagreeing with him at every turn, he would force Edsel to fight back.
I think he was just a weaker person. He didn't have the strength. I mean, Henry Ford, I think, was much tougher. Edsel was just a really nice guy. Well, nice guys don't necessarily go places in life.
With the success of the Model A, though, Henry and Edsel Ford were going in the same direction.
It was perhaps the only automobile on which the two really collaborated very much. Henry had a lot to do with the mechanical details of the car. Edsel had a lot to do with the way the car looked. Had they been able to collaborate like that both earlier, and had they been able to continue that collaboration, Ford might not have lost its lead to General Motors.
October 1929, shocking news from Wall Street. The stock market had crashed. Millions were out of work. Of course, Ford's great personal fortune kept him far removed from the nation's suffering. Normally, public speaking paralyzed Ford. But here he joined good friends Thomas Edison and Harvey Firestone in an historic radio broadcast offering their wisdom on the Depression.
If a young man makes up his mind to work, there's no limit to what he can do. If he makes up his mind to go at it without the idea of work, he hasn't much chance. He must study and work, and he must go back in any art as far as he can, just dig up the very beginning, and he must, the more he goes back, the further he will be able to see ahead.
As removed from the suffering of the common man as Henry Ford had become, even he was about to find the Depression striking close to home, right at the gates of his great Rouge River plant. The Depression devastated working America. For many, there were no jobs, no money, no hope. Ford Motor Company was better off than most. The company rode out the first year or two on the strong showing of the Model A. Henry Ford even fought a one-man war against the Depression by raising his workers' wages and dropping the price of his automobile. But he could only hold out for so long. In 1931, the Depression caught up to Ford. After 3 years on the market, Model A sales fell dramatically. The Chevrolet, with its 6-cylinder engine, and the new Plymouth cut into Ford's market share. Once again, Ford was forced to shut down production and send workers home. Those who stayed found their wages cut. Frustration boiled over. On a bitterly cold day, a crowd gathered to march on the Rouge plant and confront Henry Ford with a demand for more jobs. At the Dearborn city limits, local police had massed, but the marchers ignored their orders to disperse. Police attacked, and a full-scale riot broke out. Machine gun fire finally dispersed the crowd. In the aftermath of the fighting, 4 young marchers lay dead. The 5th died several days later. There were no new jobs. What finally brought the workers back to the Rouge was yet another of Henry Ford's inspirations, the Ford V8.
The V8 was Ford's last great triumph. Chevrolet had brought out a 6-cylinder engine, which was more powerful than Ford's 4. Henry didn't like 6-cylinder engines, so he wanted to go to a V8. A V8 Ford, something like a Roadster, could probably do 70, 80 miles an hour. You strip it, it might go even faster.
Tributes from all over celebrated Ford's return to genius. His fan mail included some surprises. John Dillinger, Public Enemy #1, wrote Henry Ford saying, "Hello, old pal. You have a wonderful car. It's a treat to drive one. Your slogan should be, drive a Ford and watch the other cars fall behind you. I can make any other car take a Ford's dust." And Clyde Barrow of Bonnie and Clyde fame also felt moved to compliment Ford. "Even if my business hasn't been strictly legal," he wrote, "it don't hurt anything to tell you what a fine car you got in the V8. With the success of the V8, Ford found time to turn his attention to Herbert Hoover's 1932 re-election campaign. Ford was still painfully shy about public speaking, but he offered these words.
I support the best man for the job. Herbert Hoover should be allowed to carry out his program, and I think he will. He has faced the enemy for 3 years now. He knows all the tactics of the forces of destruction. Why bring a new recruit and retire a seasoned leader? I think of him as a human-hearted, honest-minded, hard-working Hoover.
Americans in record numbers disagreed with Henry Ford's politics in 1932, but given the sales of his V8, Henry Ford and his son Edsel had reason to feel optimistic as they looked ahead.
They have been asking us what we think of the coming year. All I can say is that we feel pretty good about the outlook. The United States, even when it is running in low, is a pretty big business proposition. But I believe the country is getting ready to make a very decided step forward next year, and we are doing all that we can to help it along. What do you think of that, Father?
Well, I think everybody's decided that they've got to go to work. I think from now on, that there's no one can stop this great country from going ahead.
And those that went to work at Ford found labor relations falling apart. Henry Ford said that the average man wouldn't do a day's work unless he was caught and couldn't get out of it. Inside his plants, he saw to it that nobody shortchanged him. Ford supervisors and foremen, many of them ex-cons and boxers, ruled the plant through fear and coercion. When more production was needed, the line was simply sped up. Heaven help the man who couldn't keep pace.
The work was hard. I used to come home so tired. My wife used to have to rub my hands because I used the hands a lot. And to fall asleep, I used to fall asleep reading the newspaper. I'm just a young man.
How was my working life at Ford? I've never been to hell, but heard a lot about it. It was like working in hell. The harassment, the threats, the working conditions, and the continued watching over you by what they had called at that time star men.
It was like Big Brother was watching you. Henry Ford was behind everything. In the 1930s, he cloaked what he was doing behind something called the service department and the goons that he employed to terrorize workers. But there's no doubt it's what Henry Ford wanted as well. He'd become old, his arteries had hardened in terms of his spirit. He was a different man from the young idealist who got things started.
Ford and his workers had come a long way together. Over those years, first through generosity, later through intimidation, he had been able to hold the line against the unions, even after Chrysler and General Motors had been organized. But finally, in May of '37, hostilities reached a head. Union organizers, led by Walter Reuther and Richard Frankenstein, had received a permit to hand out leaflets at Ford. They made it to the top of the overpass leading to the plant. Then they were met by members of the Ford Service Department. The fight at the gates of Ford left the Union leaders battered, but no further ahead in their struggle. It took another 4 years of pushing and pulling before something finally broke. On April 1st, 1941, Andy Dewar, one of the workers in the rolling mill, changed labor history at Ford.
One day, Andy just got fed up, and he and the foreman had an argument. All of a sudden with an Irish brogue, a Scottish brogue, God damn it, I'm tired of taking this BS. Get away from me, strike, I'm gonna strike, The guy look up on the line, strike, strike. The other guy would holler, and it'd just be, strike, 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 strike. It just went from one department to the other in the rolling mill. That's where all the finish of the steel was made. Without steel, you can't make a damn car.
Ford was preparing for a long fight when his wife surprised him by joining the battle. Clara Ford demanded that he settle with the Union. It was totally out of character for her to interfere, but Clara was afraid the situation would explode into real violence. And so she threatened to leave her husband if he didn't put an end to the hostilities. Ford called his representative and told him to sign. And that was that. Ford Motor Company was a union shop. While peace was restored for the moment, Henry Ford was about to face personal tragedy on its most profound level. Edsel Ford had been president of Ford Motor Company since he was 25 years old, but there was never any doubt about who really ran the show.
Henry Ford was an engineer and a tinkerer, and Edsel was a completely different man. Edsel was a very gentle man. Edsel was a man who endowed the arts in Detroit. Edsel was a designer. Edsel was a modern thinker, and he was the kind of man, it seems to me, that his father, Henry Ford, had a difficult time dealing with because they were really opposite personalities. I think Henry Ford, the history books will always look upon the first Henry Ford as the originator of the company and so forth and so on. And yeah, I do absolutely believe Edsel Ford was underlooked.
What Edsel Ford lacked was the ability to stand up to his father. For years, Henry Ford undermined his son at every opportunity in a campaign to make him stronger. Edsel Ford internalized the conflict and carried on at Ford his steady presence of balance to Henry's unpredictable ways. When World War II broke out, the Allies suffered defeat after defeat. The nation naturally looked to industry for help. Everyone was expected to pitch in. Ford was asked to produce jeeps, troop carriers, trucks, tanks, and more. But the company's most important project was the B-24 Liberator bomber. With Ford approaching his 80th birthday and not yet recovered from a 1941 stroke, supervision fell largely to Edsel, and he had medical problems of his own. Still, company spokesmen were optimistic enough to predict that one B-24 would roll out of their plant every hour. But by the end of '42, only 56 planes had been built, far short of the prediction. In May 1943, Edsel Ford died. A number of illnesses contributed to his death: stomach cancer, liver cancer, and in the last irony, undulant fever, the result of drinking unpasteurized milk from his father's dairy. It is said that Henry Ford was never the same after his son's death. But at the age of 80, in spite of his clearly diminished capacity, the old man once again took up the reins of Ford Motor Company. The news concerned Washington. As the nation's third largest defense contractor, Ford was a major part of the war effort. With production in serious trouble, there was talk of bringing in outside managers or even nationalizing the plant. In August 1943, the Navy sent 26-year-old Henry Ford II home to Dearborn and the Ford Motor Company. Maybe Henry Ford's grandson could bring some order to the chaos that Ford had become.
One of the executives of Ford after the Second World War, Jack Davis, said the company wasn't dying, it was dead, and rigor mortis had already set in.
For months, Clara Ford had been pushing her husband to step down and let their grandson take over. But Ford held out. Finally, Edsel's widow, Eleanor, confronted her father-in-law. She threatened to sell her considerable holdings in Ford if her son wasn't immediately named president. The old man finally relented. In September 1945, the crown was passed to Henry Ford II. With his active role in the company behind him, Henry Ford began to disconnect from the world. He passed some time at Greenfield Village and was trotted out on occasion at a company function. But the stores of energy that had sustained him well into his 70s had been spent. On an April evening in 1947, Henry Ford laid his head on his wife's shoulder and drifted away. The cause of death was a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 83. Tens of thousands of people lined up to view Henry Ford's body as it lay in state. Some factories closed, others shut down for a moment of silence. In all, it's estimated that close to 7 million workers were involved in some demonstration of sympathy for the man who had irrevocably changed their lives. And in Detroit, motorists were asked to come to a complete stop at the time the automaker's body was being lowered into the ground. For that second, when the automobiles came to a stop, Detroit was returned to the way Henry Ford had found it.
It had already been raining a couple of days in Michigan when Henry Ford returned home from a vacation. It was the spring of '47. On his second day back, the Rouge River flooded and took out the private powerhouse that supplied his home with heat and light. That evening, Henry and his wife turned in early. The power still hadn't returned, and their room was lit only by an oil lamp and a few candles. Before the night was out, Henry Ford, the father of mass production, the inventor of the modern age, left the world just as he had come into it 84 years earlier, by candlelight.